Her talk today, Advancing Second Language Proficiency and Intercultural Competence in Postsecondary Education, will highlight possible strategies for demonstrating and communicating the value of language programs. Please help me welcome Dr. Spino.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to the LRC for sponsoring this, to Angelica and Annie for showing me around all the very many beautiful waterfalls. I've been having a good day. So we have, can the Zoom people hear me? Yes, can they see me? Ooh, I see me. Okay. All right, good. That all makes sense. So we can make this a little bit less formal. If you have questions while I'm talking, I do not mind. Raise your hand. We can chat it out. That sounds great. And then I'll also leave time at the end for some questions. All right. So the talk today is Advancing Second Language Proficiency and Intercultural Competence in Post-Secondary Language Education. I'm going to start with a graph that I literally see when I close my eyes at night. Can anyone guess what this will be? It is the enrollments graph. I think about this so much, so very much, from the Modern Language Association. What I really think about is not the whole graph. I think about the graph from 2009 on. As you can see, that's the really interesting part, but not for the best of reasons. We're declining in terms of enrollments in languages other than English. If you look from 2009 to 2013, it's a 6.7% decrease, which isn't great. But then if you look from 2013 to 2016, it's even worse. It's a 9.1% decrease. And then if you look from 2016 to 2021, it is I wrote this out, 16.6% decrease. So not only are we like dropping in enrollments, we are dropping ever more precipitously. So like, what is causing this precipitous drop? And I think the scariest part is that I'm not sure we know. And we need to know in order to correct it. It could be the elimination of language program requirements that has been happening more and more, even at my own institution. So we could be seeing effects of that. It could be something related to perhaps the perceived value of languages across the United States. Enrollments in post-secondary institutions are down, but they're not down that much. So we're losing at a faster clip than what post-secondary education at large is seeing. If you go back, we are like, this ends at 2021. So we're just starting to see the impact of COVID in this graph, which probably doesn't bode well for us. And then what we don't see at all is the impact of AI in this graph, which I don't know. Will that have an impact? We're going to find out. Yeah, right. I'm starting off really happy. Isn't this great? They can only go up from here. We just start you at the floor. So when I look at that graph, when I close my eyes at night and it still projects itself on my eyelids, I think to myself that as a field, we really need to articulate our value. And we need to do that to students because they're the ones that are going to fix the enrollments, right? We need to do that to upper administration because as our enrollments drop, our programs close, right? And I'm talking nationally. So we need to think of effective ways to argue that to upper administration. And we need to think of effective ways to think about that ourselves, right? So that we can articulate that value to students and to upper administration. So when we think about value, that might be context dependent. There's no one solution to how we articulate our value as language programs. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about my institutional context and what this could look like here. And perhaps that can be replicated at certain institutional contexts across the US. So I hail from the University of Rhode Island, which is a public land-grant institution. We have, I think it's about 16,000 students total in the ballpark. I come from the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures, which is a multi-language and a multi-major department. So we have German, Spanish, French, Italian, global language and area studies, which you can specialize in Japanese or classics. And then we also have Chinese. We have no university language requirement. So any students that we get in our doors, we have to convince them to come into our doors. We get nothing for free. No seats for free at URI. We have almost 30 full-time faculty members. And even though we don't have a university language requirement, we have lots of majors. We're a pretty healthy department in terms of major size. Now, of course, we function as one department, so this is collapsing across all languages. But in fall of last semester, we had around 600 language majors, which is not an all-time high for us, but it's still good. I mean, we're happy with that. So a little bit more about URI. The reason why I think we have so many majors is that we have something that we brand as signature international programs. These are dual degree programs that pair a language major with some other field. They all include a study abroad component, and then depending on the program, often an internship in the target language while they're studying abroad. This all started with our international engineering program that was founded a long time ago in 1987, where students earn an engineering degree and then also a language degree. It's a 5-year program. They study abroad the first semester. They take classes about engineering in the target language. Very difficult. I could not do that, but mostly because I can't do engineering. And then the second semester, they do an internship. So this has been a super popular program, and of our 600 language majors, about 200 of them are in this program. So it's very cool to have a third of your students be engineers, not so common. So with the foundation of our international engineering program, we had some copycat programs that I say we, but really I mean they, my predecessors created. We have our international business program and our international computer science program, which are not as large as the international engineering program, but follow kind of a similar-esque structure. We also have a Chinese flagship program, which is one of the 8 Chinese flagship programs in the US. All of these students are also double majors, but they can have their second major be in almost anything. And our Chinese flagship program has about 80 students, I'd say, in it. And then we also have the International Studies and Diplomacy program. And just because I direct this one, I'm going to go into it in a little bit more depth. And I think that this program can help embody a little bit the value that we can argue that language programs could have. So International Studies and Diplomacy, it is a dual degree program where students major in international studies, which is comprised of like political science classes, economics, maybe some anthropology. And then they also major in one of the languages that we offer. They study abroad for at least a semester at a site that I approve. And it has to be a site that I approve because they have to reach a language proficiency benchmark. They have to reach advanced low speaking proficiency on an LTI test, on a language testing international test. So we have an externally validated measure of their oral ability in the language that they study. And because there's that like extra requirement, it can be a very difficult program for students, which is great. We love that. And because of that, a lot of our students decide to study abroad for the entire academic year, which is very cool. I think Open Doors, which like computes all the study abroad data, I think they say like of all the students that study abroad, only like 2% of them or something study abroad for a whole academic year. And if you look at our signature international programs in the IEP and the engineering one, all of the students study abroad for an entire year. And in this program, the majority of them do as well. These are like real high achieving students. I love these students. 75% of them are triple majors. That has to do with credit math because it's kind of easy to pick up a third major in political science or economics because you can double count some courses. And also I'm risk averse, and as an advisor, I am risk averse for them, and I'm always afraid a student's not going to meet the benchmark, and I still want them graduating with at least a double major. So we advise them to pick up a third major, and they generally do meet the benchmark, and then they just graduate as a triple major. Aren't they happy? So when we think about value in the URI context, come on in, have a seat. There's a natural goal if you think about the structure of how our language program operates, and that is to prepare culturally competent, highly proficient speakers of language with international experience in the professions. I think that this is emblematic of kind of all of our programs. And so when we think of value, what is the value of studying a language at our institutional context? A lot of times that gets focused in terms of intercultural competence and then also language proficiency. To my colleagues' credit, we've been very dedicated to these goals. And I'll just give you an example of how dedicated we are to these goals, because I think it's kind of unique. So in 2017, before I worked at this institution, so these are not my ideas, Karin de Bruin was our chair, and the department engaged in like this really deep realignment where they thought about what they wanted for students and how they could foster student success. And they settled on, given the structure of these programs, developing language proficiency and intercultural competence. Karin and I have an article in the what was called the ADFL Bulletin that kind of describes the whole process of how this happened. That's what's cited there. And so they hired a proficiency coordinator. I had never seen a call like this in my entire life. I thought it was weird. I'm like, what do you, first of all, they had a call that was to coordinate the development of language proficiency across students, which is not something you typically see. And then they had it open language, which was also very odd, right? Like you could be a Chinese professor or a Spanish professor or a French professor. And the reason why I say that is that it's very emblematic of how this department functions. They work as a unit across languages, and they decided, we're understaffed in everything. What do we care if this person does Chinese or French or Spanish? And so they hired a proficiency coordinator to help the development of language proficiency across all the languages in the department. And then the next year, they hired a coordinator, which is my colleague Bing Mu, to help develop intercultural communicative competence across the entire department, across all languages. And she happens to teach Chinese. And so with both of these different initiatives, we engage in large-scale testing, faculty training, and curricular revamping. And I'll talk more about that soon. All right. Now, what I think is like the most interesting thing about this is that Karin de Bruin, who was the chair at the time, she's a literature professor. And so I find this highly fascinating how she came to the conclusion, with the input of all of my colleagues, that we should really be focusing on proficiency and intercultural communicative competence. I think that speaks to her credit. And also, like, it jives with things that we know, right? So, for example, the very popular MLA report in 2007 calls for deep cultural knowledge and linguistic competence. They say that these are equally necessary if one wishes to understand people and their communities, right? So, sorry, that was like my really long preamble. And now we'll get into the actual content. We're going to explore 3 questions today. One is, what is proficiency in intercultural competence? 2 is, to what degree do they develop in post-secondary studies? And to answer this question, I'll describe a study that my colleague Bing Mu, completed. And then 3 is, how can they be framed to communicate at least part of the value of post-secondary language education? I'm not claiming that this is the only thing we do, but at least it's part of the value that we offer. So number 1, what is proficiency in intercultural competence? The way that we'll operationalize proficiency today is the ability to use language in spontaneous, unrehearsed, real-world situations. You can contrast that with performance, which is what we try to do in our class, right, to get students to perform well in practice situations. But really, what we want them to do at the end of the day is to be able to implement that in the real world. And so we use the ACTFL guidelines to measure proficiency here at URI. And we do a lot of testing. I'll explain that in a moment as well. For intercultural competence, one of the definitions that I see my colleague Bing use a lot is this one by Fantini. It's the complex abilities that are required to perform effectively and appropriately when interacting with others who are linguistically and culturally different from oneself. So this is different from proficiency, right? Like you can have a very high degree of proficiency in a language and still not be able to interact effectively and appropriately, right? So the proficiency, in order to like be good out in the world, you need something more than just being able to communicate. So successful intercultural communication involves both intercultural competence and communicative competence. And at the end of this, I have a QR code that you can just use to download the slides if you want, if that makes anyone's life easier here or on Zoom. Okay. So we use the ACTFL guidelines to talk about proficiency. What we have used up until now to talk about communicative competence is the Intercultural Development Inventory. What this inventory is you can actually take like a test to see where you fall on this spectrum. It has 5 different stages. The first stage is denial, where you just miss cultural differences entirely. They glaze right over you. The second is polarization, where you judge differences. Third is minimization, where you like de-emphasize the differences. Like, oh no, there are differences, but we're all the same. 4 is acceptance, where you deeply comprehend differences. And then 5 is adaptation, where you can actually bridge across these differences. You can take, there's like I'll explain it in a second, but there's like an actual questionnaire that you take, and you can see where you place. I will confess that I am not at the adaptation stage. I need to improve myself, apparently, but knowing myself, I don't expect myself to be at the adaptation stage. I am at acceptance, so I can accept cultural differences. Okay, so that's what proficiency in intercultural competence is. So now that we know that, I'll talk a little bit about a study that we did that looks at the development of these 2 constructs in post-secondary education. So we have a recently published article in 2025 in the Modern Language Journal called Charting the Development of Second Language Proficiency and Intercultural Competence in Post-Secondary Education. There's been a lot of research on the development of language proficiency. Thanks to some grants, we know that students do make gains in terms of proficiency at the post-secondary level. I think, like, depending on the study, it's like, what is it? Like a third of a sub-level per semester or a half a sub-level per year. So something like that, but students do progress in our classes. Yet, the MLA notes in their report that 4-year language majors often graduate with disappointingly low levels of linguistic ability. This is not surprising when we think about what language acquisition is and the amount of time it takes to acquire a language and the confines of exactly how much time students spend with us in class. Like, that's not a shocking outcome at all. And so a lot of times we look at study abroad to hopefully increase contact with the language and students' proficiency. Whether or not that works really depends on if the student just lives their life in English abroad or not. Depends. In terms of the development of intercultural competence, studies generally measure intercultural competence in study abroad programs or like intervention studies. This is like the typical type of research that is done with intercultural competence. But there's relatively little research looking at the impact of foreign language instruction. So like in our classes, how good are we at increasing students' intercultural competence or moving them along that spectrum? And if there are studies, they're usually for like a short-term duration, like a semester or a couple of semesters. And so what we were interested in this study is looking at the development of language proficiency across the whole post-secondary education, and then also intercultural competence across all of post-secondary education. And we were interested in, even though there's research on study abroad and intercultural competence, we were interested in like what it means as part of a larger educational experience. So not just like a pre-test before they go abroad and a post-test when they get back. Like, no, what does it mean integrated into a broader language study? All right. So we had 3 research questions. The first one is, how do students' proficiency and intercultural competence develop over time in their post-secondary studies? The second is, we wanted to know if there was a correlation between students' proficiency and intercultural development. You could see how perhaps these things are related, right? Like if you have a higher proficiency, maybe you're able to kind of interact more and therefore gain more intercultural competence, right? Or similarly, if you have a higher level of intercultural competence, maybe that gives you more access to communicative events where you can talk to people. So in theory, perhaps they could be related. We wanted to see if they were. Do students who study abroad evidence higher proficiency and intercultural competence than those who do not? So for this study, we had students take the oral proficiency interview computer, and then we also had them take the IDI. That's a 50-item Likert scale where you read sentences like, is it appropriate that people from other cultures do not necessarily have the same values and goals as people from my own culture? And then you put to what degree you agree. From that, so the IDI, they have like a whole training thing. It's like a couple days long training. I must admit, I do not do the training. So I don't know what the algorithm looks like to give you a raw score. But from that 50-point questionnaire, you get a score. I don't know that they even tell you in the training, now that I'm thinking about it. You get a score, a numerical score that places you somewhere in this spectrum. If it's lower than 70, you're at denial, 70 to 84.99 polarization, and then you can see for minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. And it gives you 3 scores. One of them is your developmental orientation. So that is like where this scale, the IDI, puts you. So where it says you are. And then somehow it also gives you your perceived orientation, which is what you think of yourself. But they're not asking you overtly, right? It's not like you're asking the student, do you think you're in denial? Like, it's not like that. But judging, like, based on their answers, they yield where the student must think themselves to be without overtly asking them. And then there's also like an orientation gap, which is the difference between where you are actually placed versus where you must think you are placed. All right. So for this study, we used, and for most of the studies, they just use the developmental orientation. All right. Does that make sense? We good? Okay. So here were our participants. We had students from various different languages: Arabic, Chinese, French, German, Italian, Japanese, and Spanish. I want to explain really quickly what I mean by midpoint and endpoint students. In this study, we collected, it's a cross-sectional study, so it's not like the same student took the test multiple times during their study. It's cross-sectional. We have one snapshot being at the midpoint. That differed by language, but for all of the language, it was some kind of bottleneck course that students were definitely going to pass through. But exactly where in the curriculum that fell differed by language. So for example, in Spanish, it was the 6th semester course. All right, so it's not necessarily Spanish 101. All right, it was the 6th semester course in Spanish. For Italian, it was the 5th semester course or the 6th, depending on the semester. So yeah, it just differs a little bit by each language. And then the endpoint were students that were enrolled in the highest level course that was offered at this institutional context. All right. So they were either at the end of their studies or very close to the end of their studies. So we had 189 midpoint students, 107 endpoint students, and 296 total participants in this study. All right. Who here likes box plots? This is a box plot. You'll be able to decide in 3 minutes if you like box plots or not. Many people don't. So for the first research question, we wanted to look at the development of proficiency over time. What this is showing you. We have these are the speaking test results. We have the ACTFL levels from novice low all the way up to superior. And so each dot is a participant, right? So like this person placed at novice low. Does that make sense? In the middle, oh, we're going to pick this one because it's easier. So if you look, oh, sorry, Zoom people, you can't see my pointer. If you look at the box plot that is blue, right in the middle, the very middle of that, that is the median. All right, so if you lined up all the scores, which one's in the middle? And then within the box, you have 50% of the scores. All right, and then the tails are 25 on top and 25 on the bottom. What the box plot gives you is kind of like a general layout of how participants scored. So we'll go one by one. So like if you look at the midpoint, right, the red side, participants scored at about 5.23, which is intermediate mid. So the vast majority of students are pretty much intermediate mid. Most midpoint students, 58% of them, scored either intermediate mid or intermediate high. All right. And if we look at the endpoint students, their median is intermediate high. All right. So they are scoring higher. And when we did the stats, we did see that the endpoint students were statistically higher than the midpoint students. So what does this tell us? That students, I mean, this isn't like a bombshell news flash here, that students' proficiency increases over the course of their studies. Great, we should hope that. All right. So now let's look at the same for intercultural competence. All right. We have the same thing. We have the midpoint and the endpoint. We have the numerical scores on the y-axis, but I broke it down by like denial, like where is denial in all of this? It's a river in Egypt. Polarization, minimization. So right, you see them on the side and you can kind of like see like, oh, that student all the way at the bottom is in denial. All right. So when we look at this, we see that the difference statistically is approaching significance, but it's not there. And then if we look at the effect size, like the magnitude of that potential difference, it's very small. And so what that's telling us is that there's effectively no real difference in terms of the development of students' intercultural competence between the midpoint to the endpoint of their studies. So while they develop in their proficiency, they are not really developing in terms of their intercultural competence. And something to point out, most of the students at the midpoint are in minimization or denial. And at the endpoint, 50% of them are in minimization, 32% are in polarization, which is lower. 10% are in acceptance at that point, that's good. And 7% are in denial. We wanted to see if there was a correlation between proficiency and intercultural competence. This is, I call it a bubble graph. I'm not sure if that's a technical term. I'm a mom of young kids, so they look like bubbles to me, okay? And in this bubble graph, you can kind of get the vibe that there probably isn't a correlation, right? For example, if you look at students that are at intermediate high, some of them are in the denial stage, some are in polarization, 26 of them, 44 of them are in minimization, 6 are in acceptance, like they're just all across the board, all right? And in fact, when we ran the correlation, it wasn't statistically significant. So these two constructs don't seem to be correlated in this study. For our third research question, we were interested in the impact of study abroad as part of like, general studies. So we took just the endpoint students, so the students at the end of their studies, and we took only the students that had studied abroad for at least 3 weeks. So it was going to be at least some time abroad. And so that left us with 26 students that had studied abroad for at least 3 weeks, or 77 that did not. Those numbers might seem weird given how many students study abroad in life. This was pandemic time, so it's great for studies. Pandemic is lovely for studies. So we did this over the pandemic. It kind of messed stuff up. So now the findings are very tentative here. But we did not find any statistical difference in the speaking scores of those who had studied abroad and those who had not. So the students that studied abroad were not speaking better than those who had not studied abroad. And we also did not find any statistical difference in terms of their intercultural competence for those that studied abroad and those that did not study abroad. But those are really tentative findings. I'm just not sure because I mean, the sample size of 27 is probably not good enough.
What year was that?
2020 and 2021, I think, were the 2 years. Not the best years. Yeah, Annie. All different types. And in fact, the range of duration of study abroad varied. So like some of them were there for 3 weeks, but I think the average was like 13 weeks. So I mean, if you really did like and we did not, but if you did kind of a more like deep dive analysis with every single data point, perhaps you could start to see something, a better trend than that. But we did not do that. We collapsed them because there were so few of them. Yeah, great questions. So proficiency does grow over time, bombshell newsflash, but without structured support and interventions, intercultural competence is unlikely to grow. They're not correlated, and so maybe it would be useful for us to consider these constructs separately. Something that is interesting about this study is that when you think about the midpoint, I said it's like, I defined it in terms of how many semesters they had. So like maybe like around 6 semesters, depending on the language. That's pretty correlated to proficiency, ideally, right? Or we have an articulation problem, but hopefully that is related to proficiency. So the midpoint in this study is based on proficiency, but not intercultural competence, right? Like we don't actually know that that's the middle of their progression of intercultural competence. That could be a completely different ballgame. And in fact, we've changed the testing protocol at our institution now, and my colleague tests them when they enter the program and then when they leave, so that it's divorced a little bit more from their language proficiency. These findings also suggest that we should rethink the impact of study abroad, very tentative though, and that students need to push themselves outside of their comfort zone when they're abroad. Okay. So that is our study. And so when we think about proficiency and intercultural competence, how can these be framed to communicate at least part of the value of post-secondary language education? Now, it doesn't mean that intercultural competence has no value because students don't progress in it. That's not necessarily true, right? We just need probably more specific interventions in class for them to be able to progress. So I'm going to tell you how this all shakes out at my institutional context. In terms of testing, we do lots of testing. We primarily use ACTFL or LTI tests, and then we also use the IDI. These tests are funded by course fees, so students are assessed a $25 course fee, and then we use them to do our language center, to pay for tutors, to pay for these tests. For proficiency testing, we started with testing speaking, and now we test listening, reading, and receptive and productive vocabulary. I'm in charge of all the testing. It's a lot. It's fun. I'm getting lots of emails as we speak because it's testing time. But we've seen lots of benefits of this testing. Students receive scores, so they actually like know where they are. There's positive washback, right? Because professors know that their students will be tested and they want their students to do well and have the ability to speak. And then they think back, oh, well, maybe we should be like actually working on these skills in class so that they can ultimately learn to speak the language because they will be tested and we will know if they cannot, right? And so, yes, that's how we see the improvements in language instruction. In terms of faculty training, this is something that I really appreciate about my department. We have undergone extensive training. I will start though. I know everywhere has a hiring freeze, but when you can, you should still hire experts in language instruction. But if you can't hire experts, you should train the faculty you have. And even if you can, you should still train your faculty. And so all of my wonderful colleagues engaged in extensive training, both in terms of proficiency and intercultural competence. All of our full-time faculty have done a 4-day OPI, ACTFL OPI tester training course. 4 days. Can you imagine? They gave up 4 days from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. or whatever it is. Like that, we're at that level of dedication. Several of them became ACTFL OPI testers. And these are across research specializations, right? We have literature professors that are ACTFL OPI testers. We invited Irvin Scherner, and he gave so many workshops. he is truly wonderful. He's an expert in this. And then for intercultural competence, we've also just done a ton of in-house workshops and invited guest speakers. In terms of curricular revamping, we got a lot of support for this. The Dean's Office funded a complete revamping of our curricula across all major granting languages over 2 summers. They gave us summer recontracting for that. That was mostly to revamp in terms of proficiency because the Intercultural Communicative Competence Initiative hadn't gained that much steam when they were willing to fund us, so we did it without it. Some languages utilize integrative performance assessments as a way to revamp, and these curricular improvements are still ongoing. It's an iterative process. In terms of curricular improvements, we're also thinking about what we can do outside of a language classroom. For example, this semester, I'm teaching for the first time LeAnne 240X, which is developing second language proficiency. It's a language agnostic class, so I work with students studying all different languages at URI. And it's a course that explains to students how to best acquire a language outside of class. And the rationale is that we know that class time is not enough. Classes are not always staffed with language experts. I'd say that my institution is doing a really good job of at least learning. And students need to understand how languages are acquired so they know how to maximize that time outside of class. And I got an MLA Pathway STEP grant, also from the Mellon Foundation, so very, very thankful to create this course. And by the way, my students love the podcast from the LRC. I assign them as homework. So yeah, it's very adorable. I assigned one from Patsy Lightbound. And then they were like, well, I think Lightbound would say, and they were contrasting it with Van Patten. Actually, I think Van Patten, because we did a Van Patten reading, I think Van Patten would say, and it was very adorable. So thank you to this center for hosting this talk, but then also giving my kids homework. And these are the student learning outcomes for the class, just to give you a vibe. My own personal opinion, I think students are stakeholders that we don't think of in terms of educating them in what we know about how languages are acquired. Like, I think we pull them when we need them. Like, why aren't you taking classes? But I think we also need to work with them to educate them as to what they should do outside of class. Because let's face it, given the way language acquisition works and time works, the vast majority of their languages will be acquired if they go far outside of class. So when we think about the value of proficiency and intercultural competence, here are some final thoughts. I wrote an article that's forthcoming in now the ADL Bulletin with my previous chair that started this initiative. And we are rethinking everything, right, in light of world events. And so we're thinking about why proficiency still matters. And we came up with, when we think about value, it emphasizes career readiness, which is important. It offers curricular coherency. It allows us to measure the effectiveness of our language programs across time. It justifies resource allocation. So for example, like if you need a small class size, that makes sense, right, to upper administration if you have clean and clear proficiency goals. It facilitates the studies of humanities in our classroom. One of the most beautiful things I'd say for me about this initiative is how professors in literature really bought into this because they could finally figure out ways to scaffold students, according to their proficiency, into having the discussions that they really wanted to have with them about different texts. And I think that that's been beautiful. And so, yes. I'll let you read the last point, and then we'll skip it. And I think we can communicate this value to various different stakeholders, right? For students, when we think about proficiency and intercultural competence, they link clearly to professional goals, to employability. It facilitates study abroad. That's generally a pull why students want to study languages. When we think about ourselves, about faculty, it's a mechanism to preserve the humanities, right? To get students into class and then to be able to have the discussions that we want to with them. It presents avenues for growth as scholars and teachers, right? I can't say that I honestly thought about intercultural competence before I got into this department. And now I think about it way more than I would have otherwise. And it fosters collaboration, at least it has for us, across languages and across research specializations. And then in terms of administrators, they like it because it's a differentiator, right? I mean, how many universities really actually purposefully promote and study these things and make sure that students are developing? And then it also aligns with our university strategic plan, which apparently you need to align everything with the university strategic plan. And so we do. So 5:15. I'm very, very happy. We are right on time. But before I stop, I want to thank all of my wonderful colleagues at the University of Rhode Island. This is such a collaborative effort, from the dual degree programs to all of the proficiency testing, all of the intercultural communicative competence testing. All of it is a real group effort from every single person on that screen. And so I'm thankful to all of them, especially my collaborator, Bing Mu, who worked with me on this study and also is my guru to all things intercultural competence. References, and thank you. So I'll love to take questions.
Yeah, hi, Lincoln Snyder, Georgetown University. So I started a language program evaluation as part of a project with an in-house program in Germany with Georgetown. And one of the gaps I noticed was a disconnect between the explicit and the implicit curriculum, with intercultural competency being one of those implicit things. So I was looking at an intervention coming up of a guided reflective journal to help students better bridge implicit and explicit expectations. Have you worked with journals at all, or journaling, or has that come up in your research?
Personally, but my colleagues have. Okay. So there are a couple of studies that came out of my university by Sigrid Burka and Bing Mu, where they look at like different things that you can do with students. And they did this with students that were studying abroad, but still enrolled in classes at our university. And they did things like journaling and all of that to help make explicit to them, first of all, what their own cultural orientation is and how they themselves perceive the world, because sometimes you don't think about that. And then also to people watch and observe and to contrast. So not me personally, but my colleagues, yes. While we wait, I'll tell you that I was just in France for work. I had to do a site visit for the IST program. And I learned that in France, this is my own competence growing, that you're not allowed to smile at babies. You know how like in the US, you see an adorable child, and if someone is here, I got corrected, okay? So if anyone here is like from France and says that you can smile at babies, I was smiling at babies that I found to be adorable, and my colleague like knocked me and she's like, stop doing that, it's weird. Don't smile at these babies. Like, I'm so sorry. No, I was not abducting any babies. I don't know. I really like kids, so maybe I was a little over the top. I might have been interacting with some random stranger child, so maybe that crossed a line. I don't know exactly where the line was, but I learned about myself that I am very enthusiastic about small children, and I need to watch that. Yeah. If you give me the green light to smile at babies, I'll be happy again, because I was fighting that in myself the entire rest of the trip.
Okay. So the study abroad is not very much correlated with intercultural competence, but as you said that the students are like the range is to vary, like from like 3 weeks of study abroad. Is there a reason to include those students into your research? Because semester long may be very impactful.
Very fair critique. Yeah, the reason was that was the pandemic and there were 27 students that studied abroad total. So we are very clear about this caveat in the paper that it's very tentative and that you need more research to look into this fully. Yeah, so no, the reason is pandemic,
Okay,
which
good.
is probably not the best reason.
Right.
But
And then as a language instructors here, then what would you recommend for us to improve intercultural competence in classroom activities?
Yeah, oh, I wish I had my colleague here. She'd answer this question so much better than I will, but I'll give it my best shot. A lot of it can be kind of awareness raising, right? About what your own actual orientation is and how you perceive the world. And then they can do things like observation of other people and cultures and what they are doing. You can have them compare and contrast, right? So all of these types of things. One of the things that she argues for is understanding where they are in terms of the curriculum. And then, sorry. And then, so where they are and then scaffolding them across the curriculum or across the spectrum, if that makes sense, right? So if we know that a lot of students are in like polarization or minimization, right? Or even denial, like first you need to teach them that these differences exist, right? And that is how you move them from denial to polarization, right? And then you have to work with them in terms of polarization, in terms of how they judge these differences, right? And so she advocates for taking like a tailored approach in terms of where they probably are on this spectrum, in terms of thinking of logical interventions that you could do.
Well, adding to that,
Yeah.
so for the stage of denial students, I think it will be really challenging for them to move up to the polarization. Then
Yeah.
what kind of suggestions can you provide?
Yeah. I mean, if we look at the if we look at them, not yeah, there's a lot of them that are in denial. That's so rough. I mean, I think it's important to recognize why they could perhaps have these particular orientations. My colleague has a study where she looks at students who went abroad and then looks at like what things that occurred abroad could potentially impact the progression, because it's not always linear, right? It's not always like they do better. Sometimes they come back and they're lower on the spectrum. And so like what types of things that happen abroad could have influenced how that needle moved. And like one of them is trauma. Like they experience racial discrimination abroad and they just close down. Right. So I think it really is kind of like a tailored thing of kind of looking at all different possible explanations for why they're even in that spot to begin with. Right. Because if you think that, for example, in denial that differences don't even exist, you need to be shown differences. Right.
Is that inventory free?
No. It is so not free. You need someone at your institution that is trained to administer it. It's an online survey, like students can take it at home, but you need to be able to be trained, I guess it's to interpret the scores. And so that has a cost. And then the actual questionnaire has a cost per student.
And I think that also just answered one of the Zoom questions.
Oh,
the
yeah,
cultural
okay.
competence test is available.
Yeah, so
to
it's not something that you could just give your students to like get a quick idea of where they are in your classroom. No,
Gotcha.
unfortunately.
I'm sorry to ask a question about this when you just said that your colleague wouldn't be able to answer it better, but I found it really interesting, the perceived and what was the observational difference?
Yeah, the here
I
it
can
is.
definitely imagine how that would happen and how students think that they're open-minded and they're missing things.
Can you
like
guess
that,
what
but-
direction that goes in?
Yeah. But I guess, yeah, ask your colleague, I wanted to ask if there's more studies on those, like what kind of students, what is there something that causes that difference? How can you fix
So
that? Is that an inherent thing from students?
So we haven't published this study, but we actually looked into that. We looked at, because for proficiency, we look at self-assessment. long story, like when you take the OPIC, self-assessment is an integral part because you have to assess your own ability, and that will determine the form that they give you and the possible ranges that you can receive. So like self-assessment really matters for proficiency in our program. And so we started thinking about like self-assessment in terms of intercultural competence. And so we actually did that. Like we looked at the developmental orientation and the perceived orientation in that gap, and like how far apart they are. Students generally perceive themselves to be better than what they are actually. But in terms of the rationale for why, I don't know.
Or even if that might change, like I almost feel like they would, from these experiences that they have, that the perceived orientation might go up faster than the developmental. They might meta awareness of their own ability.
Yeah, now I'm remembering our graphs. It might have been, am I misremembering? I think this is right. When you are lower on the scale, the gap is higher, and then it closes as you like kind of funnels. I haven't looked at that graph in 2 years, but I'm fairly certain that the graph I made had kind of like a funneling effect.
And if it's like that, I think in terms of selling it to the university, I think that would be an important thing to point out as well. It's like, oh, look, they're not developing intercultural competence, but it's like, as people, we are developing them to be more aware of what they're capable of doing.
Yeah. For sure.
I wanted to kind of go back to your starting point, which was participation in foreign language programs. And so as a recovering K through 12 administrator, I spent a lot of time looking at literacy and its overall decline. And really, I think, one of my hypotheses is the decline in interest in foreign languages is actually just a symptom of an overall decline in literacy. They're less interested in L1 as well. Do you see, like with the students coming through your programs, that the starting point at which they're starting to engage with you is different than it would have been, say, 5 years ago, even with the group you've got?
Yeah. What's interesting is that for our proficiency testing, we started with speaking testing, and then we slowly integrated more skills, reading being one of them. And so I don't have a lot of pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic reading data, but I will say that the reading scores are generally lower than the speaking scores. And perhaps that that is a nod to just general literacy writ large and ability to read and to focus on longer texts too, right? Because if you think about the ACTFL scale, the higher you go up on that scale, the more discourse you have to be able to handle, right? And so we're so used to now like short things that you can just flick away like that. And so really to work towards kind of more advanced paragraph level or even superior multi-paragraph level skills, it's just how often do older children engage in that length of a text? I think it's getting not as frequent. So I could see how there could potentially be an L1 to L2 effect.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the work that Evian did on proficiency showed exactly that too, that reading scores were always in all of the language proficiency flagship testing we did. That was always the case. It was always lower.
Yeah, we started the reading tests after Irvin came with us.
I'm interested in the student profiles. In the last few years, my students, a lot of them are bilingually raised or come with 2 or 3 different languages. So I find it easy in certain ways to make them aware of their own starting point vis-a-vis some others, because it's ingrained in the makeup of the classes. So did you look in there with
in terms of their proficiency, in terms of their intercultural competence?
Just what they're bringing to the table, the different type of language resources they're bringing, and does that reflect how where they are in the intercultural competency?
I like the question. I teach Spanish for heritage speakers consistently at my university. We didn't pull apart any specific demographic in terms of that. And the answer is I don't know. Like, I don't know, for example, if the students in my class are really perceiving their culture as the other culture and then acculturating themselves into a different one. I'm not convinced that's what's happening. But I mean, we did not pull out the data, so I don't know.
Okay, being mindful of time, considering that it is the Thursday before spring break.
Thank you for being here. Highly impressed.
Exactly, yes. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to everyone on Zoom for joining us as well. And please help me in thanking LeAnne for this wonderful presentation. Thoughtful, lots of food for thought for all of us. And do mark your calendars for our next speaker on April 22nd. That date has changed from a long time ago, but it is the 22nd. On chunking in language learning and teaching. I wish all of you a glorious spring break. May you do nothing